सभी को राम राम स्वागत है मैंने कहा इंडियन एफएम की इस लाइव सेशन में मैं हूं आपके साथ प्रनील so today we have a little bit of a different flavor of topics. I have with me Guy Slocum from the New Nation Party, the new political party. So we'll be discussing the party today and the policies, and of course with the general election coming up we'll be discussing a whole heap of things. So this is a very important episode, so stay tuned. So Guy, welcome to Maneka Indian FM.
Good morning. Good to be here.
How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Fantastic. And you're joining us from here in Auckland?
Yes, indeed. I have an office in Half Moon Bay, and that's where I'm speaking from now.
Fantastic. So why don't you just give us a brief introduction of yourself, and then, of course, some introduction about your party.
Yes, surely. Well, very briefly for me, I joined the British Royal Air Force at 17. I became a fighter pilot chasing Russians around the Iceland-Faroes Gap, and I did that for 12 years and raised myself through the ranks until I was running my own flying squadron.
Wow.
I then left and joined an investment bank in London because that was an area of interest and I wanted a change to my career. But I really didn't like corporate life too much. There were too many people crawling up the greasy pole, and I think it should be good enough to be professional. So I left and formed my own international investment company. That ran in 18 countries for 39 years, and I sold it 4 years ago. Today, I own a natural healthcare company. And of course, I'm also the deputy leader of the New Nation Party, as well as being their candidate in the central Auckland electorate.
Yes. As usual, I don't really prepare much for these interviews, and we hadn't actually done our intros beforehand. We discussed a whole lot of other things, but not this introduction. But so that is quite fascinating. So tell me about the New Nation Party. When was it set up? Why was it set up? And its main mission, yeah.
Yes, surely. Well, we set up the party approximately 3 years ago, and we did so not because we had any desire to get into politics. We're all business people who've had a lifetime of business management, and politics was the furthest thing from our mind. Yeah. But as things started to unfold in the last 10 years, it's become increasingly apparent that our so-called politicians do not provide leadership. They dictate to the people they are supposed to serve, and they have long ago forgotten that their job is to represent the people who sent them to Wellington. And so using our leadership experience, we felt that the nation deserved some genuine, compassionate leadership. And that's why we put the party together, to give people choice, because in the past, as you will very well know, there has been an adequate choice between Labour and National, with the sort of hangers-on of ACT and Greens. But today, Luxon has brought the National Party, sadly, so close to Labour that there's no daylight between the two parties, and people need an alternative choice. New Nation Party is that alternative choice.
It's quite interesting that you mentioned that, because as I was saying previously, that a lot of voters are, I think, undecided, including myself. And the divide or the difference, because traditionally Labour has been for the workers and the National Party for the business folks. So is that sort of line becoming quite blurry nowadays?
Well, I don't believe that division, which, and you're quite right, of course, that was the original division. I don't believe that exists anymore.
Right.
In the 1930s, when the employers weren't looking after their workers, there was a very strong case for unionism. There was a very natural progression from unions into the political party called Labour, and they did a very good job at looking after the workers and making sure they were protected and given a better working environment. Today, there is legislation to cover all that. And anyway, the mindset has changed. Most employers, and I know there are exceptions, but most employers realize that not only from a compassionate point of view, but from a commercial point of view, there's no point in training a workforce and then losing them because you don't look after them.
Yeah.
Where the difference exists today, I believe, is not the original difference, but it is the difference between whether you look after the needy by generating business so that business grows and develops, which means that wages increase. And as business develops, the tax revenue increases, and therefore there is money to look after the needy people.
Yeah.
Labor, unfortunately, don't have that perspective because they don't have the experience in business, and therefore they have to borrow to look after the needy, and we end up in the dreadful debt situation that we currently suffer in New Zealand.
Yes, there is a problem, and there's on the ground there's a growing sentiment, well, kind of against the so much spending that we do in the social welfare. So from what you've said, there's a variety of things we can cover, but possibly what is your party's main sort of policies?
Well, I mean, the key that we have to start doing before we even get elected is to return democracy to New Zealand. You only have to look at the way the current so-called government have brought in legislation that they never campaigned on. And that's one detriment to democracy. When you look at the demonstration that occurred in Wellington, whatever you think of that demonstration doesn't matter. The politicians should have gone down to talk to the demonstrators, and most of all, to listen to them. They didn't need to commit to anything. But the fact that not one member of parliament came down to talk to the demonstrators, for me, that was the day that democracy died in New Zealand. Right. And to return democracy, we need to do two very key things. We need to say to the electorate, remember you have two votes. Use your candidate vote to elect the person, irrespective of the party they belong to, the person who will best fight for you and take your issues to Wellington, and make sure that the issues of the electorate are represented at the center of power. And the second thing they need to do is to recognize that we need to make sure that no political party has the outright power that Ardern so abused over the last 6 years. And therefore, we're asking the electorate to say, just this once, in order to sort out the dreadful mess that New Zealand is in, we need you, irrespective of your traditional political allegiance. We need you to put your party vote into the New Nation Party. And we will build an army in the Beehive that will ensure that whatever controlling party is in charge, they will not have the ability to do extreme things or exercise draconian power, because we'll be there to keep them to account.
That's a very good point, because I don't think a lot of people, well, this education needed as to how MMP really works and how you should use the party vote as opposed to the candidate, the electoral vote. So that's a good point that you mentioned, that you can vote for different parties and different candidates and things like that. And no doubt the Electoral Commission will do some education on that. But that's a very good point. And I have seen, I think, in the last few elections, the allegiance changing. You see dramatic votes of how people in one electorate vote differently for the electorate seat, and completely different for how they vote for the party. And
yes, and if I may say so, I have great respect for anybody who places a vote with any party, because that is democracy. I might not agree with them, but I respect utterly their right and their opinion to do that. But we have a crisis in New Zealand at the moment. It is a crisis that is every bit as much a crisis as if enemy troops were holding off the shore. And that comes from an organization called the WEF, run by a chap called Klaus Schwab. And he believes in a communist world government, and he's very honest about it. He's not trying to hide it. But the
point is it a New Zealand organization, or?
Well, the point I need to make is that it's an international organization that was just a think tank to begin with. But about 25 years ago, he started to run courses for potential leaders. And Jacinda Ardern went to one. Many of her Labour colleagues here in New Zealand have been on them. Luxon is a fan of the WEF. Now, the unfortunate thing for ordinary citizens in New Zealand is that the United Nations have now adopted what's called Agenda 2030, which is the WEF plan for world government, and they have been trying it out on the New Zealand government. And many of the crazy things that you see this government do, like introduce the sexualization of our children into schools, that is not something they thought of for themselves. That is something they were given to introduce by Klaus Schwab via the United Nations. So the very first thing we will do when we have the authority to govern or enough influence to get it done, we will exit the United Nations, return sovereignty to the people of New Zealand, and allow whatever New Zealand government is in place to act according to the rights and needs of the people without influence from any foreign entity. And that's a vital point. And if I may just briefly conclude that point, my worry is that Luxon is a fan as well. And I know that because my team have been posing questions to him at his public meetings, and he refuses to refute his connection, or at least his desire to support the principles of globalism and the WEF. And that's another reason why we had to form the New Nation Party, to give people a choice to reassert the independence of the New Zealand government.
That's a very, very good point. I mean, I wasn't aware of this particular organization, so it's good that you mentioned it. But I'll tell you my story. So when Jacinda introduced the policy to tax the rental properties, to tax on income, and this, it's a very stupid thing to do, because it's the only place in the world where you're taxing the income rather than the profit. So that's when I started to really dig into it, and that's when I found her roots to socialism and as I said, the communism link to this particular organization. So that's where I sort of started putting things together, and I said, oh, this is very, very bad if it goes in this direction. And the thing about the United Nations, yes, a lot of people are disconnected with it.
Yes, and may I just say, Pranil, that many of your listeners will and your viewers will worry about what I've just said, and maybe even think that it's a conspiracy theory. And ladies and gentlemen, I say to you, don't take my word for it. Google WEF, or World Economic Forum. Google Agenda 2030. It will only take you about 15 minutes to get the gist of what they're talking about, and then you will realize the crisis that we're in.
Yes, definitely. Agenda 2030, you said, right? 2030. Yeah, I've got it up here. And the other important thing is that you mentioned, which I would like to talk about, is not to take small parties lightly. As we have seen before. Do you want to talk about that? You only need one seat, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, the reality is that we are a government in waiting. And by we, I mean all the small parties.
Yeah.
I was campaigning on the Tauranga by-election when it became, and that was, as you probably know, a little over about 18 months ago. And the people there were clamoring for the small parties to come together.
Right.
And so we sponsored a number of meetings and took part in other meetings that others put together. And we made it abundantly plain that we were willing to talk. We were willing to talk without preconditions, and that the service that we could give as a combined team of parties to the people was infinitely larger than we could do on our own.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, everybody said, yes, we should join together, providing we can be in charge. And that is clearly unworkable. So what we have said now is, okay, we will put in place policies that are policies of a future government. We will invite the electorate to recognize that they now have a vehicle of alternative choice in the New Nation Party. And just this once, give us your party vote so we can sort out the mess. And then next election, we can go back to a more traditional party fight.
Yes, yes. No, this is a very, very important point. And as I said or mentioned that in the previous elections, smaller parties have basically had the balance of power. So it is quite important.
Yes, and if I may just quickly interrupt and say, many of your viewers will be holding on to the belief that a vote for a small party is a wasted vote.
And
I have to say that historically, that was probably true, because the two main parties were very close together in past elections, in the run-up anyway, and therefore a vote away from any of them would have possibly let the other one in. That is historical. That is no longer the case. We now have two main parties that are close together, that do not offer choice, and therefore a vote for a party like the New Nation Party is a vote to free people from the shackles of the dictatorial power that Ardern introduced and Luxon embraces.
Yeah, it's a very, very good point. Certainly, as I've seen, well, not the last election, but the previous to last election, as we saw the New Zealand First Party holding the balance of power. That was, I think, that was the change of how New Zealanders vote now. But the previous election, I think, COVID sort of being there and in its early stages, and because the Labour Party, was in charge, so they just took the publicity and that. So the last election, I think, was probably an outlier. So you said,
without doubt, you're absolutely right.
Tell me about your seat, your electoral seat that you are standing in the Auckland Senate. I haven't looked it up recently. Previously, it has been quite hotly contested. So, who are your opponents standing this time? And just before that, I'll add to the viewers that I actually approached a lot of all the political parties who are registered in New Zealand, and only the New Nation Party guy has come forward and is willing to talk to me. So I don't know why people are not wanting to talk to me. Do you want to say something about that guy?
Yes, I think there is a sad lack of interest. Excuse me, a sad lack of interest from the political parties in talking to anybody who they don't think is their power base. Right. So, National have their power base and Labour have their power base, and they only want to talk to those people. The New Nation Party is a party for all New Zealanders, irrespective of their ethnicity, irrespective of their political leanings, irrespective of their culture. We are here to lead all New Zealanders out of the misery and mayhem that currently exists. And that's why I accepted willingly and gratefully your invitation, because we need to talk to every Kiwi. And we need to hear from every Kiwi, which brings me to a quick plug, if I may, and that is to ask your viewers to look out for my public meetings in the city, because it isn't just about what I want to tell you, it's about what you want to tell me, because my job is to represent the people of Central Auckland, and I can best do that by knowing what the issues are important to you. So please do look out for notices. You can get that information on our Facebook page,
Yes.
which is NNP:*New Nation Party. Or if you want to know more about the policies, because we're limited today, go to www.nnparty.co.nz and you'll pick up a lot more information. But coming back to your question, the Central Auckland electorate comprises the CBD, the bays, Mechanics Bay, Freeman's Bay, Mary's Bay, St Mary's Bay, and the CBD area, and just a little bit of Newton, and a little bit of the area around the hospital. I'm opposed by a fine bunch of people. There is Chloe, of course, Swalbuck from the Green Party, who is the current incumbent, and then the Opportunities Party, the Labour Party, and the National Party. And I have to say, they're all good people. I don't agree with them, and we, I'm sure, will have wonderful debates, discussions, and even arguments. The problem I have is that if the voters of Central Auckland send one of them to Wellington, that person, I'm absolutely convinced, will go down the road full of enthusiasm, full of determination to support Central Auckland. But when they get to Parliament, they come under the party whip. And they are told exactly how to vote in order
exactly what to speak, isn't it? Like what you speak in Parliament is given.
Absolutely. And they're given their speeches. That won't be the case with me, with New Nation Party, and indeed any New Nation Party candidate around the country, because we decided a long time ago that we would not have a party whip, because we cannot see how the representatives from the regions can possibly represent their voters if we have a party whip. And the other point, to conclude very quickly on this point, is that if we can't convince our own caucus of a direction we want to take the party, then how on earth can we convince the country? And so there isn't any case for a party whip. We won't have it, which will mean all our candidates, including me, will be totally free to represent the issues and the important factors from our electorate.
Yeah, good. So just before I start talking about Auckland, what are your points of difference? You sort of said that you're party for all New Zealanders. I think the Green Party and also New Zealand First, they also claim such things. So what is the major point of differences?
Yeah, the major point of difference is that when we come up with our policies, they are policies that have characteristics that will change the lives of New Zealanders. I'll give you an example. The National Party yesterday released its transport policy, and actually so did Labour. And it was all about, 40-year plans to build large motorways and create big routes. And that's all very laudable. But we don't have the money for that. And anyway, there's no point in planning a Warkworth to Whangarei motorway while the rest of the roads around the country are full of potholes. So our policy will be to deal with matters that quickly, directly, and importantly affect the people of the country. So, for instance, we need to reopen Marsden Point and get the bitumen out of the processing, because our lack of bitumen going into the potholes means that pothole repairs last about 6 weeks. And so I give you
what are they using nowadays? So you're saying lack of bitumen. So what are they using?
A sort of gravelly, concretey mixture And if you see them pour it into the holes, as I've watched them do, it's not difficult to understand how quickly it disintegrates, especially with the sort of rain we've had just recently.
Right.
I'll give you one more example on
Yes.
answering a question on differential.
Yes.
You know, I'm appalled that our citizens cannot travel around their cities, especially this one, our largest city, and feel safe. The crime that's going on, and it's petty crime in terms of the action, but it's not petty crime in terms of the victim, because it's traumatic, it's damaging, and it's ruining the economies of many small dairies and small supermarkets. Now, you know, National will come up with, or have come up with, wonderful plans of boot camps and all that sort of thing. Now, I'm not decrying that necessarily. What I'm saying is that the effect of that policy will take ages. And meanwhile, another dozen supermarkets or dairies are being raided. We have a crime policy, or actually it goes beyond crime. It's a law and order policy. And it has about 8 component parts to it. And I'll just give you a couple of examples so you can see what I mean. For instance, we will introduce legislation immediately to change the bail laws to say that for certain crimes, you go straight to custodial bail. In other words, you don't do bail in the community. So a ram raider, for instance, will be picked up, will be taken to the police cells, will be arraigned before the court in the morning, and then even if they're held on bail, they will go to prison. And they will be held in prison on bail. And with the sort of delays in the court at the moment, they're going to be there for a very long time. So I want these young men to know that the minute they get caught, they're going to prison. And that will work as a firm deterrent. But in the wider sense of law and order, and I'm still staying with your question on what makes us different, we have to address the wider issues. For instance, judges at the moment, when they're sentencing somebody, have been advised by the government to start at the baseline of the sentence and then start to knock off years according to things like youth, family, first offense. We will change those guidelines because at the moment they are resulting in soft sentences that people do not feel is a deterrent. And I'll just give you one more example from our law and order. One of the problems, as I alluded to a moment ago, is that we have a backlog of cases. And it's not fair letting people wait for that long. And it certainly isn't fair for the victims to wait for closure. So we will introduce night courts alongside the day courts so that we can get through the cases quicker. So coming back to your question about what makes us different, practicality. Practicality and an impact on everybody's daily lives as quickly as we can, so they feel the difference in the way that they're living day to day.
Yes, now there's a very, very good points, and there's a couple of things coming. I'll get to it shortly. And but one more thing that's coming up to mind is I think a few elections ago, I think there was another party which started, I think, in Epsom. I can't remember the name of it. Oh, Colin Craig. He was the guy who was running it. So the reason I'm bringing that up is because that party started, and a lot of people showed enthusiasm and interest in a new party to build a new movement. So it's just coming to mind. So I could think of one example where something starts and people are ready to start something new, start something fresh. Of course, that party it didn't do well. But what I'm trying to say is and to the viewers that don't think this is a new nation party, is a new party and probably won't do any good. I'm saying that new parties do start and they do gain momentum. Anything to
Yes,
say
they
on that?
do. Yes, they do. And, you know, I don't want this to sound too trite, but
Mm,
I have to tell you that the New Nation Party is the first party in the history of New Zealand,
mhm.
excuse me, not to be formed out of a desire for political power.
All right.
We had no desire to get into politics,
Mm,
but being leaders and leaders with some experience, we knew that the Kiwi public had to have a party that was pledged to lead them out of the misery and mayhem that I mentioned earlier.
cool. So I'll get to a few points in a little while, but one other point that's coming to mind is the pothole situation you mentioned. So I'm not sure you know. So I was born in Fiji and spent my youth there. And so the pothole situation is a situation which we were dealing with in Fiji back then. So, 30 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, that was the issue there. And that issue we are now dealing with in modern New Zealand, and modern New Zealanders should not have to be dealing with pothole issues.
Well, and isn't it crazy, you know, that it's taken all that time? But I think it's a mindset issue.
Mm,
You know, politicians, and we are not politicians. We're finished with politicians in this country.
mm,
We need genuine leadership.
mm,
Um, but the traditional politicians, and I'm sorry to have to say this, but they come up with ideas that they think will be popular. And I'm afraid we are determined to come up with solutions that are practical and that people will feel the effect of in their daily lives and feel the improvement. Now, that might not be sexy. It might not be super, super attractive, but people will feel the difference. People will know they're being led. People will know they're being cared for. And we look forward to the task ahead.
cool. Fantastic. So there's two main issues that you raised. So about the crime, especially with dairy owners and most of them being from Indian backgrounds, it's especially traumatic when something bad happens. Even the minor injuries, it affects a lot of operators. So the crime is a problem, and as I said, there's two aspects to it: the lighter sentences, yes, of course. The other main issue I think is probably bigger issue is the youth crime. So what we are seeing is people, youth underage, being made to commit all these crimes, and they get off quite lightly. So what's your views or policies around that?
Well, they will. I mean, the policy is the same, really. You know, if you want to behave like an adult criminal, then you're going to be treated like an adult criminal. And I'm not going to treat you like a child if you're not going to, if you're going to behave like a criminal adult. And so the same principles will occur in terms of incarceration. But the difference is we need to make sure that we don't mix our youth criminals with our more seasoned criminals, because it simply becomes an academy of crime, and that can't be allowed.
Right.
But the other thing is, deterrent. A lot of the young fellas who are doing these ram raids are really doing it because it's crazy to say this, but it's raising their street credibility with their peers. And when they realize that they're going to be locked up because while they were awaiting trial, they will suddenly realize that, they're not going to go home to mum and dad tonight. They're not going to go to college in the morning. They're actually going to be in a little room 6 foot by 4 foot. And when they, and we won't just suddenly do it. We will make an announcement that as of the 16th of the next month or whatever, this will be our policy. And so be warned, know that it's going to happen to you. And every indication from our research is that that will be a huge deterrent. Because you see, we have to turn things around. This crazy government has got everything upside down. What in my local dairy, when I go in there, the poor man who runs it is hiding behind a cage for his protection. In other words, he's in prison. Whereas the people who should be in prison are walking through the community. If that isn't an upside down situation allowed by this government's softness on crime, then I really don't know what is.
It's a very good example that you've given. I've seen that as well. And again, I go back to the Fiji situation. So in Fiji today, if you go to certain shops in certain neighborhoods, exactly, you'll find even worse. You'll literally find yourself walking into a prison where, you know, the guy's got huge bars, and if you want something, you have to ask for him. He'll go get it and things like that. So again, you know, it's a situation where we've left in Fiji, but now we are dealing with it in modern New Zealand, which we shouldn't be doing. And the thing about lighter sentences and and how the judges make the sentences, it's a very good point which you raised, and I've certainly seen that, where for serious crimes, you know, sexual assault, I've seen it that, you know, for those sort of crimes, people are sent to community sentences. You know, and just wearing the bracelet, people get the bracelet, walk out. You know, the shooting we saw in the CBD, the same thing happened. The guy was on a community sentence.
Well, you're right. And you see, they get to those soft sentences because they start with the basic sentence and then start to reduce for all sorts of reasons until they come down to a community service. Now, that's because sentencing guidelines are issued by the government to the judge community. We will amend those guidelines to say, no more of this reducing. If you've got a guilty person before you, you must sentence them according to the Sentencing Act and not bring them down to a ridiculous punishment. But you know, so much of it is mindset. At the moment, we have twisted not only to the point where our dairy owners are in prison and the perpetrators are walking free, but we've got this curious mindset running through society that says the victim doesn't matter. We've got to take care of the criminal. And that's why they are returned home. One of our aspects of our law and order policy is to be able to provide services for the victim and to look after the victim and to care for the victim and to have regard for the victim when the criminal is sentenced.
Yeah, good points. What was the other thing? I think we should now talk about Central Auckland being your electorate. I think Auckland is literally in quite a mess, isn't it? The Queen Street, you know, you go in there, you can hardly go in there.
Dreadful.
And the tunnel that they're digging up, that's chased a lot of businesses away. And certainly the law and order situation, we all know. So, yeah, and other thing is probably a lot of people who don't quite understand, I don't think I quite understand it. So in Auckland, what is in the jurisdiction of the MP? What is under the council? What is it with NZTA? So how does it work, and what can you control as an MP?
No, I think you make a very good point there. Let me touch on the three key areas first, and then I'll come back to your question. Of course, one of the areas, and everybody knows this, is crime. You know, K Road, which used to be a hive of Saturday night entertainment, has now become a hive of crime. And people won't go there. The retailers are beginning to pack up. Even Chloe Schwalbeck, the MP, is too frightened to go there and talk to the retailers. I'm going down there next week for another meeting with the retailers, because again, if I'm going to contribute to the resolution of that problem, I need to hear from them and make sure that we address what's important to them. So our general attitude to law and order applies very much to Auckland, or certainly to Central Auckland, and of course to Queen Street. The other thing about Queen Street is the way the retailers have suffered. You walk down Queen Street on a Saturday morning and you'll find either closed shops or shops that have staff in them and no customers. and we need a regeneration plan to bring business back into Queen Street, back into the center for the benefit not only of the retailers, but of also the customers themselves. And the last thing we've got to do, well, it's not the last thing, but the next thing that I would want to see addressed is the traffic flow. You know, again, it's part of the upside down world that has resulted from this Labour government. What we have is we have cones all over the place because the people controlling the building work have absolute authority to throw a cone down wherever they like.
Right.
And they have been led to believe that they must overact on the safety issue. And therefore people call around. So a traffic flow plan is needed. It will mean temporary one-way streets, but at least people will get the traffic moving. Now, coming back to your question, there's one very good organization called Heart of the City, run by Viv Beck, who you may know as one of the mayoral candidates.
And she pulled out, isn't it?
Yes, and so input from them is important. Of course, the mayor, the council, and the local boards are the people who are really responsible for this. So coming finally to your question, my job is to find out how I can support those organizations at the center in order for them to have the resource that they need to follow through on their plans. It would be not only improper, but it would be a real spanner in the works if I were to wade in with my solution. And so my job, to answer your question, is to support those local boards, support the council. And I've written to the mayor and to Viv Beck, asking if I can sit down with them and understand the issues that are important to them and where I can best help from central government.
And how's the uptake been? Have they accepted your proposal, or are they willing to?
I haven't had a reply yet, but I wouldn't have expected one by now, to be honest. So I'm not in any way blaming them for no answer. They probably would only have got it at the back end of the week that's just gone. And, you know, they've got a full inbox. So I'm hoping to get an answer. Well, indeed, I need an answer in the week to come. And if I don't get one, I shall be knocking on some doors.
Cool. Yeah, we've got some time, and there's got a few listeners joining in. Of course, a whole heap of listeners will of course listen to the recording and view the recording. So I think probably next 10-12 minutes. Is there anything you want to cover in particular, or should we just briefly run through the key set in stone policies that you've got in your website?
Well, I'd probably bring to the fore, if I may, alongside law and order and returning democracy, I would like to shout out really to all seniors, because our senior citizens have been ignored by successive governments of both colors for far too long. These are people who have worked a lifetime. They've produced taxes which have kept the community going, and they deserve respect for that. And they deserve to be able to live out their final years in peace, harmony, and tranquility. And at the moment, they can't do that. I'm sure you see them walking around the supermarket with their little notepads, desperately trying to figure out how much more they can buy. And most of them have now come down to one meal a day and one tiny meal at that. So we have a policy that is very much a priority on our list to improve the life of our seniors by wiping out tax on super, by giving them free dental, free medical, free denture as well, because some of them probably need that as much as the free dental, and a whole raft of policies that they will see on our website that will mean that their lives are the kind of lives they deserve after a lifetime of work.
Yeah, certainly that's a very important point which you've raised, and it'll ring a bell with a lot of our listeners as well, who have people in care homes and things like that. And a lot of our listeners are sort of reaching the pension age, so all of those things, yeah, that needs to be taken care of. What about the early childhood situation? Being parents, and a lot of parents in the viewers. Yeah, so I don't think the situation is really actually working, right? The care for the young ones while you want to go out and work. All that situation. What's the policy and views on that?
Yeah, well, we need to recognize as a community that nowadays, generally speaking, both parents need to work in order to create the lifestyle that they need for themselves and their children. And we've got a ridiculous situation under this government that a mother who has to pay childcare costs, even for just one child, is actually better off net not to work, stay at home and look after the child and go on the benefit. And that is a ridiculous situation that is both mathematically and from an esoteric point of view, that's a dreadful situation. So we have to boost the allowance for childcare to the point where a mother can, or indeed a single father, if that's who's running the family, can send their child to childcare, can go to work and still be better off. That to me, that doesn't sound like an earth-shattering policy. It sounds like common sense.
Yeah.
And I always say to people that they won't like everything I say, because you can't please all people all the time, but they will always know that whatever I say and whatever we do within the New Nation Party will be common sense and fair. And that's really what fuels our attitude to early childcare. But if I may just stay, Pranil, for a moment with education.
Yes.
We have to do something about this dreadful act that has just been passed, and the instructions have been sent to the school boards. And it's generally regarded as the Sexualization of Our Children Act. There's a more formal name, but and what it requires the school to do is to teach 5-year-olds about gender identity.
Right.
And the clear point is here that they will be challenged to actually think about whether the gender they have is correct or not. Now, I have no argument with transgender adults. If they want to move between the genders and they're old enough to make a valid decision, then that's entirely their matter. And I would want to create a free society that allows them to do that. But my 5-year-olds couldn't even decide what they wanted for tea, let alone what gender they were. And if you follow this act through as the children get older, they are being introduced to sexual matters ahead of time.
Right.
I'm all for traditional sex education to our teenagers. They need to understand the whys and wherefores of that. But there is a difference, and I guess this is what it comes down to, Pranil. There is a difference between education and indoctrination. And where the act is taking us at the moment is firmly into the area of indoctrination. That has to stop. We have to return to education and making sure that our children are fit for a life in the world to come.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I've got kids in school, and a lot of viewers also are in that situation. So there'll be various initiatives, as you said, political initiatives going in that way. But what I'll say to parents is, if you see things like that in the school, you must definitely challenge it. I've certainly challenged a lot of things.
Yes, and tell your boards, tell the board of your school that you do not want your children to endure this kind of indoctrination, and that you will be withdrawing them if they continue to do so. But, you know, we haven't got too long. We've only got 6 weeks to go.
Yeah.
But the point I have to make, you know, we talk about all these policies and we talk about returning common sense and a safe environment to New Zealand. I have to say this to your viewers. We can promise all that and we can be determined to introduce it all, but you need to give us the authority to do it. And that means being brave, being courageous, being sensible, using your 2 votes in the way that I spoke of earlier, so that we are in a position to serve the community in the way that I'm talking about. But if you know, as I often say to my audiences when I'm talking live, I say, we can't do the job for you if you don't do the job for us. And so, you know, a bit of a sales pitch, but we need your vote if we're going to serve you in the way that I've spoken of.
Yeah, I think we'll finish very soon. If there's any questions from the viewers, you can feel free to put in the chat. If we can't answer it now, we'll answer it later. But the thing we haven't touched on today is health. So health, I think hospitals are in a complete mess. What are you going to do about that, and what's your views on that?
Well, the first thing we have to do, of course, is get rid of the mandates. Now, I know that Hipkins said that all restrictions were lifted the other day. Well, if that's the case, why is he not allowing doctors and nurses who are not have not had the jab? Why is he not allowing them back into hospitals? And so, you know, it's part of the nonsense of cosmetic legislation as opposed to practical ones. So the first thing we have to do is to get our doctors and nurses back to work. Then we need to look at the training scheme. You know, 20, 30, 40 years ago, nurses were trained in a hospital alongside experienced nurses, and they gained by example, they learnt by doing, and they ended up not only helping while they were learning, but they ended up as very efficient nurses. Today, they have to go to university, get a nursing degree, which is all theoretical. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but nursing is a practical profession. And so we need to turn the training back to a more practical situation, because the other thing is that the way it's done at the moment, they go to university, they learn a lot of theoretical stuff, and they run up a huge student loan because they're not earning. When they go into a teaching hospital, as they did 40 or 50 years ago, they're earning as nurses, albeit student nurses, and albeit not an awful lot of money, but enough to survive on, and they're becoming professionally more capable. So that's what we need to do on the nursing side. We also need to cut down the bureaucracy. Every organization needs management. And I would be the last one to deny that. But you don't need as much bureaucracy surrounding our medical profession as we have. That will free up some money, which allow us to do more in terms of training and recruitment. And we need to set in place a training program similar to the one that I talked about when my daughter did medical training in, well, it was outside London. I nearly said in London, but it was in Nottingham. She did a year of theory to learn about biochemistry and the workings of the body. And the rest of her 6 years was practical alongside people who were training her. So once we set up that, more people, more doctors will be attracted to the profession, and we will fill the gap that exists at the moment. But you know, we're back to common sense, Praneel, because when you increase the population, as various governments of both colors have done in recent years, you have to increase the infrastructure. And that isn't just roads and houses,
Mm.
it's services as well. And we haven't done that. And,
No.
and the coordination has been awful. Now, the reality is this is just common sense. But unfortunately, common sense isn't so common nowadays.
Yeah.
We intend to bring it back into all aspects of government, because I keep coming back to this point. We're not talking about some special thing called government. We're talking about leadership of the people. And people need compassionate, common sense, applicable leadership. And we get that by talking to them, finding out what the issues are from them, and then taking practical action. That is what we will do.
Yeah, very good discussions. So just before we end, what do you want to say to voters around just the general discussing of issues openly, and things like, you know, maybe participating in school boards, participating in election discussions, all these democratic conversations?
Yes, you make a very good point there. And I would encourage people, you know, when I was a parent of school-age children, I was on my school board simply because it seemed to me to be the way to contribute to their education. I didn't have the qualification or the time to teach them. But the other thing we have to do is we have to ask parents to recognize that the home is the first classroom. And they don't go to school till, I know they go to preschool, but they don't go to school seriously until the 5 or 6 area. And you know, the psychologists tell us that the first 7 years of a child's life is crucial in creating the character and behavior of the adult. And therefore I say to parents, particularly, because if we don't get our parental organizations right, we are building a false foundation for the future. And so we need to look at how we help our parents come to a point of understanding that they are the first teachers, that their children learn by example, and that the first 7 years are crucial. But I also say to general public, get involved in your community. You know, if you don't want to moan about it, then that's fine. Don't moan and get on with your life. But if you have a complaint, if you have a suggestion, then don't just sit at home moaning about it in the local club or the COSI. Go and do something about it. But if I may turn your question to a more personal level, it is vital to me that I take the issues not just of organizations, retail organizations, and organizations like the mayor and the heart of the city to Parliament, but it's also vital that I take the views of the ordinary people to Parliament, because that's who I'm representing. And so I do ask those of your listeners who either have relations in the Central Auckland electorate or indeed live there, I do ask you to make every effort to come to my public meetings, because believe you me, I'll be talking for about 20% of the time, and 80% of the time I want to hear from you.
Fantastic. So I think the time has come for us to end this session here. Very wonderful session. A lot of people watching, but that's all the time that we have. And as I said, a lot of other people will be watching the recording. So final statements from you, Guy, and of course we'll be connecting in the next few weeks. So final statements before we finish.
Well, it's really just to recap what I've been saying. Do understand the difference between the two votes you have, party and candidate. And even if you're not going to vote for me as a candidate, please vote for the party on the party vote, so that we can create that controlling force in Parliament to ensure that the people of our nation, way outside the Central Auckland electorate, never get faced with the dictatorial consequences they've suffered over the last few years.
All right, thank you so much, Guy. And again, keep listening to Manukau FM on the Facebook, on the website, and that's all the time that we have. So goodbye.